The Russians are nothing if not predictable. Among the challenges in Washington as deputy secretary was the unpredictability of the job. What was easier, and people, I say this and people think I'm joking, but I'm not. The predictability of the Russians in some way made it easier. They are predictably hostile and antagonistic.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of GNSI's Video Series. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, the Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. Today, we're joined by Ambassador John J. Sullivan. He's the former Deputy Secretary of State, as well as the former ambassador to the Russian Federation from February 2020 until September 2022. He is currently the partner at Mayor Brown's Washington, D.C. and New York offices. He's also a distinguished scholar at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and a distinguished fellow at Columbia University. Today, we will discuss his recently published book, Midnight in Moscow, a memoir from the front lines of Russia's war against the West. Well, welcome, Ambassador, to the Video Series podcast.
Great. Terrific to be here.
Well, you have a long history of public service, as you obviously culminating with the ambassadorship to Russia. But before that, you were Deputy Secretary of State. And in your book, you outline that career getting you to that Deputy Secretary of State role. Can you kind of enlighten us on that progression up to that point?
Sure.
And then what are some key highlights when you were deputy?
So my professional background is as a lawyer. I went to law school after college, but I always had an interest in foreign affairs and national security issues. But I thought about getting a graduate degree in international affairs, but I followed the herd and went to law school. It was very popular back. This is 45 years ago, 1980, 81. Went to law school, and then with a law degree, I maneuvered into positions as a lawyer in government. I split my time between private practice and going into government service. But I worked at first the Justice Department when I was a young lawyer in the Bush 41 administration, at the Justice Department, but in an office, a small office called the Office of Legal Counsel, that's in effect the general counsel of the Department of Justice and advises the Attorney General. And among the most important issues that the office gives legal advice to the Attorney General on, and the Attorney General in turn is the president's chief legal advisor, the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. Many of those legal issues involve war and peace, national security. So when I served at the Justice Department and at OLC, it was at the start of Operation Desert Shield and then Desert Storm. A lot of legal issues. Operation Just Cause in Panama. Did the president need a declaration of war for Just Cause or Desert Shield or for the kickoff for Desert Storm? So I was involved in those issues, but as a lawyer, not as a policymaker, because of those choices I made early in my career becoming a lawyer. It became an even more intense experience as a lawyer in government. I took, I served in the Bush 41 administration, and then when Bush 43, George W. Bush was elected, I had the opportunity to serve at the Defense Department, but as a lawyer. I was the Deputy General Counsel of the Defense Department. And the reason that I was selected was that I had worked previously at the Justice Department. So I had experience working in government at the Justice Department, knew some of the senior lawyers who were then serving in the Bush 43 administration. So I'm right in the center of U.S. national security policy at the Department of Defense, working for then Secretary Rumsfeld, but again, as a lawyer. I won't bore you with all my career details, but if we fast forward to 2016, I hadn't been involved in the campaign, and after President-elect Trump picked then General Mattis, Jim Mattis, to be Secretary of Defense. Secretary Mattis reached out to me, having worked at the Department of Defense as a lawyer and at the Justice Department. He asked me if I would be the general counsel, the top lawyer at the Department of Defense, working directly for him, and I was honored to be to be picked by him, and I said yes. So it was through then General Mattis that I got involved in the administration. Through him, I met Secretary Designate Tillerson, and I was asked to help Secretary Tillerson prepare for his confirmation hearing. I got to know Secretary Tillerson, but I was slated to be, and ultimately was nominated to be to work for Secretary Mattis at the Defense Department. I was nominated to be, it's a presidential appointment, nominated to be general counsel of the department, and the thought never entered my mind that I would work at the State Department. Well, it entered Secretary Tillerson's mind, and Tillerson called Mattis, knowing that I had been picked by Mattis and been nominated by the president, and asked Mattis if he could interview me to be Deputy Secretary of State. Wow. And that's a big change, right? Not just my office would be on the DC side of the Potomac River, not at the Pentagon. That was really the biggest jump in my career, was going from, don't get me wrong, general counsel of the Defense Department. There are more lawyers at the Defense Department than at the Justice Department, if you include lawyers in uniform. Each military department has its own general counsel, civilian lawyer workforce, but each military service has a judge advocate general, the judge advocate general of the Army, for example. So an important job, to be sure, but being Deputy Secretary of State is a whole order of magnitude more difficult and a much higher public profile. So I went and interviewed with Secretary Tillerson, and he picked me for the job, and I was nominated and confirmed in 2017, early 2017, and I went from being a lawyer to a policy-making client who had lawyers who worked in the legal advisor's office at the State Department. But I got to come back to a person I consider really a mentor, Secretary Mattis. He struck a deal with Secretary Tillerson, and the deal was, of course, if Secretary Tillerson wanted me to be Deputy Secretary, that was fine with Secretary Mattis. But Mattis said, and you wouldn't mind if I have an issue, I don't want to bother you, if I occasionally call John if I have an issue with the State Department. Well, it turned out that Secretary Mattis had a lot of issues with the State Department, and I spent a lot of time working with, not for, Secretary Mattis. But again, as a policymaker, not a lawyer. And that really wasn't the biggest change. The bigger change for me was what a public-facing job I had. As a lawyer, I was used to being an advisor, giving advice, not speaking publicly, certainly not that often to the press. And the requirements of the job of Deputy Secretary, so much different. The need for the United States to engage in public diplomacy for not only the Secretary of State, but the Deputy Secretary of State, to speak publicly, to give press conferences, to meet with foreign leaders, speak publicly with them, much higher level of difficulty and much greater public exposure. So I had a real learning curve starting as Deputy Secretary in 2017.
So once you're Deputy Secretary, that's the number 2 position at the State Department. So obviously very public facing, a lot of policies being made. Do you have any particular highlights of your term there as you're starting to approach,
Yeah, there were, there were a number of, there were personal matters that I was personally involved in, and then bigger picture issues for the United States and our foreign policy and national security. One of them was North Korea, DPRK. I was at the start when President Trump agreed to meet with Kim Jong-un, whom at that point he was still calling Little Rocket Man, in March of 2018. It was in the midst of the transition from Secretary Tillerson to Secretary Pompeo. And then Secretary Pompeo became the lead cabinet official, lead advisor to President Trump on his subsequent meetings with Kim Jong-un. So North Korea, starting in 2018, became a priority for the department because it was a priority for Secretary Pompeo, having been tasked with taking the lead by President Trump. But among the things I learned is it's possible to come into an office, whether as president or secretary of state, and have priorities and an idea, an agenda of what I want to accomplish in this office, and then events happen and things happen that just cause the principal or the president to be spending a lot more time doing things than he or she might have anticipated. For example, in 2017, there was a major breach in the Persian Gulf and the GCC with Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Secretary Tillerson, then the Secretary of State, former chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil, had spent a big bulk of his career on the Arabian Peninsula in the Gulf, knew all of the leaders by name, heads of state, oil minister, foreign ministers, et cetera. But he wasn't planning to spend virtually the entire summer of 2017 trying to mediate this serious dispute between Qatar and its neighbors. But that was a huge problem for the United States, and he spent a lot. The Secretary Tillerson spent a lot of time on that when he wasn't planning to. To give you a sense of what it's like being deputy secretary, what that meant for me was all of those other things that Secretary Tillerson was going to do. I'll give you one minor example. He was going to go to the General Assembly of the Organization of American States, the OAS, the grouping of Western Hemisphere countries, in Cancun, Mexico in late June. And he had to go to Doha and Riyadh, and I had to go in his place. And they were the foreign ministers of all of those member countries of the OAS. And Venezuela was and still is a problem for the OAS, a problem for the region and the United States. And it was a very high-level meeting, and I was thrust into it with not a lot of notice because Secretary Tillerson had to deal with a different crisis that no one had anticipated. And that was, I think, in some ways emblematic of my experience as deputy. The secretary gets either called to a meeting at the White House or called to address an unanticipated problem, and the deputy secretary has to fill in usually at the last minute, and makes for a stressful job.
Well, and during the transition from Tillerson to Pompeo, you were the acting Secretary of State. So did you see that magnify even more?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what it brought home to me was how important it is that the United States have a Senate-confirmed Secretary of State.
Mm-hmm.
It's rare for that position to be held by an acting secretary for more than a few days or a week. I served for 6 weeks as the acting secretary, and I think it was the longest period since the 1800s that there was an acting Secretary of State, because every day the United States needs to engage with countries around the world, the secretary speaking on behalf of the president and the United States, and the person who is fulfilling that role needs to have the credibility and the stature to communicate with foreign governments. And it's no matter who the person is, if that person is in an acting role, it somewhat diminishes the message in a sense. Is it does this person have the trust and confidence of the president? Is this person really speaking definitively on behalf of the United States? So it's a tough job, and events. Another example of just how global events can bring a crisis can appear virtually overnight. So the Assad regime in Syria uh, persisted in using chemical weapons against its own people, and the Trump administration in early 2017, in response to a use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime, had bombed an airfield where Syrian aircraft and helicopters had taken off to deploy chemical weapons. And it was a military strike on Syria by the United States. The Assad regime didn't get the message and persisted in using chemical weapons. And this was in late March, early April, probably early April of 2018, while I was acting secretary. And we developed a firmer, a more substantial military response that targeted chemical weapons facilities that were being used by the Assad regime, and we engaged in military strikes in coordination with the United Kingdom and France. So it was military action by the United States against Syria, and I was the acting Secretary of State while the strike was ongoing. I also happened to represent. I had to represent the United States at a global conference in Lima, Peru.
Mm-hmm.
So I was in Lima, Peru, at the embassy, engaging with colleagues back in Washington, with members of Congress, with senators, briefing them on what was happening. And I had the experience. I'd only seen it in movies where the attack was set in motion. So missiles were launched, aircraft were launched, but there wasn't an immediate strike. So I'm looking at my watch, and I know because some of the missiles were launched from pretty significant distance away. So sitting there knowing that there's going to be a military strike in Syria, that it's coming, but it hasn't happened yet, and making sure. I think it was virtual. It was, for the most part, most of the strikes were with missiles, not with aircraft, but some aircraft as well. So it was very stressful. I remember, I have a vivid memory sitting in our embassy in Lima, waiting to get the report on how the strike had panned out, and it was timed for like 2:00 in the morning when the facilities wouldn't be open. There wouldn't be a lot of people there to minimize casualties. But I was acting Secretary of State and participating in briefings for the president with Secretary Mattis, with General Dunford, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it was it was a very, very stressful experience.
So, for example, while you're sitting there in the embassy in Lisbon, are you also trying to figure out what are the secondary, tertiary effects that are coming out of like such a strike on the diplomacy side? Are you trying to head off anything? Or are you so during those moments where you're waiting, are you trying to anticipate, or how do you handle
I mean,
that?
there are just all sorts of things that, what are the Russians going to say? The Russians supported the Assad regime. Had a not insubstantial military presence in Syria. The Iranians also. We, the United States, had a relatively modest but still important military deployment in northeastern Syria. The Israelis. There were a lot of bases that we needed to touch. So fortunately, no one. Whenever I mention this story, people have to rack their memories and say, "Oh, yeah, did that? Yeah, I guess that I remember. because it went according to plan,
Right,
and the
yeah.
chemical weapons facilities that we had targeted were destroyed. And there weren't secondary effects that we hadn't anticipated.
Mhm.
But I didn't know that when the missiles were en route and
Right.
before they hit.
So you go from, at this point, you're acting Secretary of State, then you're back to Deputy Secretary of State under Secretary Pompeo. So how does it come up that you end up going to the ambassadorship of Russia? How does that and you discuss this vividly in your book, which is excellent.
So at that point, so Secretary Pompeo was confirmed as Secretary of State at the end of April of 18. So if you fast forward a year, a little over a year, June of 19,
Mhm.
our then U.S. Ambassador to Russia, John Huntsman, came back to Washington to brief the president and Secretary Pompeo to tell them that he was going to leave his post and was going to run for governor again in Utah. And before he went to meet with Secretary Pompeo, he sat in my office, which is down the hall from when I was deputy secretary, down the hall from the secretaries. And he told me what he was going to do, and we talked about it, and we started a conversation which continued over several weeks. And he was the person who said, the secretary is probably going to ask you to lead the search to figure out who's going to replace me as ambassador. And I can't say that it was the first thought that leapt into my mind, but it was shortly thereafter that I thought, I wonder whether I might be a candidate to replace Ambassador Huntsman. And the reason the thought occurred to me was at that point, I was 2.5 years into my tenure as deputy secretary, a very stressful job. And it was starting to take a toll on me. And I was starting to think about whether I might do something else. I didn't want to leave government because I enjoyed what I was doing. I didn't want to leave my colleagues at the department and elsewhere across the government on the playing field of foreign affairs and national security and defending the United States. But on the other hand, I definitely felt as though I'd been on the hot seat for 2.5 years. And so I thought this may be an opportunity, and it turned out to be an opportunity for me to continue to serve in an important post, to still be contributing to U.S. foreign policy, because the Russian Federation is involved or implicated in virtually every foreign affairs or national security issue of importance to the United States. Russia's involved in it. So I would still have my hand in whether it was Venezuela policy, because Maduro is supported by, among others, the Russians, North Korea, DPRK, North Korean guest workers in Russia, Russia borders North Korea. So all these issues that I'd worked, Syria, Ukraine, Russia's involved in, and I thought I could continue to play a role. And then personally, as I write in my book, I've been an amateur Russophile. The opportunity to live in Russia appealed to me. So those two strands, needing to get off the hot seat but remain in foreign policy and national security matters, and my interest in Russia combined. So I spoke to my wife, and then I went and I spoke to Secretary Pompeo. And another thing, and I write about this in the book, that appealed to me was the challenge. It is among the most challenging assignments for any U.S. diplomat serving as the U.S. ambassador to Russia, just because the Russian government is so difficult and antagonistic. The counterintelligence environment in Moscow is different from any other foreign capital. The U.S. embassy in Moscow is smothered by the FSB, the Russian Federal Security Service, which is the principal successor to the KGB. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the KGB divided into the FSB, which is the Federal Security Service, and then a Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, much smaller. The FSB is responsible for security within the Russian Federation and also significantly in what the Russians call their near abroad, which is the former republics of the Soviet Union, which would include Ukraine. But counterintelligence, the FSB has a section, thousands of officers in it. I think the best estimate I saw was something like 7,000 or 8,000 officers, and it's known, the Russian acronym is DCRO-1, which is the counterintelligence section of the FSB dedicated to the U.S. mission to Russia, which at that point had become just the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And they smother us. They are, anybody who leaves the compound, doesn't matter whether it's a senior officer or a young child, family member, they are tailed by the FSB everywhere they go in Russia. So the challenge of working in that environment was also, I like the opportunity to lead a mission in that difficult environment and to try to meet the challenge that the Russians give us.
So really, it was trading one hot seat for another hot seat in a way.
You're absolutely right, but the difference, there's one significant difference, and that is the Russians are nothing if not predictable. Among the challenges in Washington as deputy secretary was the unpredictability of the job. What was easier, and people, I say this and people think I'm joking, but I'm not. The predictability of the Russians in some way made it easier. They are predictably hostile and antagonistic. So there was never, if ever the question were asked, well, how will the Russians react? Will they react in an aggressive, counterproductive way, or will they react in a cooperative way? And the answer was always the former, in an uncooperative, antagonistic way. It makes it easy. It just makes it easier to plan. And the U.S. Embassy in Moscow has a set of operating procedures classified, which are different from every other U.S. mission around the world. They're informally called the Moscow rules, and there are two sets of Moscow rules. One is a very thick binder of rules and regulations on the operations of the mission, which are necessary because of that counterintelligence threat from the Russians looking to co-opt people who work or live at the embassy, or actually to get access to the embassy. And then there are the informal Moscow rules. And I think the number one informal Moscow rule is there are no coincidences. So the person that you see standing behind you in the line at the grocery store, who's keeping track of you and looking in your wallet, who looks just like the guy who sat next to you at the movie theater 3 days ago, that's not a coincidence. There are no coincidences.
It reminds me of was it like in Rocky IV where he's training in Russia and they're tailing him everywhere he goes? Is it that type of scenario? You just have
Absolutely. And it's everyone. It's not just the ambassador. In fact, I had less visible scrutiny of me than my colleagues. For our defense attaché office, we had at that point a much smaller defense attaché office than we used to have. We had 10 officers, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines weren't represented. And Space Force, when I arrived at least, was just forming. But everywhere they go, they would have multiple Russian officers trailing them everywhere and getting in their face, taking pictures of them. And not just them, but their family members. And, one example, this event happened after the war started, just to give you a sense of how oppressive it is. one of our colleagues, a spouse, not an officer serving, but a spouse living at the embassy, needed to go to the grocery store. She drove her white car. This is after the war started. Drove her car to the grocery store, parked in the parking lot, and of course she was tailed by the FSB. While she was in the store, it was a white car. They took out. We found it was black electrical tape, and they taped on the roof of her car a large Z, which is the symbol for the Russian special military operation invasion of Ukraine. They would mark their vehicles, uniforms, etc., with the letter Z to identify that they were from the Russian Federation, and it became a symbol for Russia and Russians of the special military operation. Billboards in Moscow with big Zs, and they taped a big black Z to the roof of her car. She came back. She didn't realize, she didn't look at the roof of her car. She put her groceries in the car and she drove back. And the FSB had drones with video cameras that videoed her car driving through traffic, coming back to the U.S. Embassy and going into the embassy. And on the evening news, honest to God, one of the lead stories was, look, even the U.S. Embassy supports our military operation in Ukraine. Here's a U.S. Embassy person with a Z on the roof of that person's car driving through Moscow and going back to the embassy. Thank you, comrade. And I remember thinking, my God, the time and effort it took to plan and execute that. You've got nothing better to do. But that's the type of scrutiny that my colleagues and I endured, and those who continue to serve there continue to endure. It's really only gotten worse.
Well, and your book does a great job of tying in those large political events along with these smaller stories like this one, where you're able to highlight the ideas of what's going on the ground that we probably didn't, us in the United States didn't see in the news or anything like that. What an intriguing episode of GNSI's video series. Today we're joined by former Ambassador John J. Sullivan, who was the ambassador to Russia during the initial stages of that country's invasion of Ukraine. As always, I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer here with the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. Thank you for joining us today, and please tune in to our next episode of our video series.